Hi, this is Rev Ed with today's Back Porch Devotional from Genesis chapter 25, verses 27 through 34. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted." Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright now." Esau said, "I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me now." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. We talked yesterday about how when Jacob and Esau were still in Rebekah's womb, the Lord revealed to her that even though Esau was the older son, Jacob was the one who would be the line of the promise. And here we see how human activity coincides with God's decree. God foreordained that the promise would come through the line of Jacob and not Esau. But many people struggle with that, and they ask, well, where does human free will come into the picture? Are we just robots? Are we automatons? Does God control everything? What we have to understand is that the sovereignty of God and human free will are not mutually exclusive. They actually end up cooperating, although people who carry out things according to their own will, without regard for God, don't realize that they are cooperating. But here's the perfect example of it. Jacob and Esau just being who they were, Jacob decided to trick Esau out of his birthright. He knows Esau is famished. He knows Esau is a rough man who doesn't think about deep and spiritual things. And Jacob is securing for himself the birthright, the rights of the firstborn. Now, the right of the firstborn, which is the promise of Abraham that flows through Isaac to his sons, is already guaranteed to Jacob because God has decreed it. But what we see here is Jacob and Esau acting out of their own free will, and their actions essentially confirm what God has already established. It's not that God made them do these things. Esau was free in his own decision-making capacity when he chose to discard his birthright in exchange for a bowl of stew, which is fairly cheap, to say the least. And Jacob, of course, his name means he deceives, is going to be one who practices deceit his whole life. And yet through Jacob's deceitfulness, God's purposes are carried out. So what we see is that God's sovereignty and his foreordaining of this choice of Jacob over Esau does not overrule Jacob and Esau's free will in and of themselves. They end up doing what God has ordained without any reference to what God has ordained. The best example of this, where human free will intersects with God's will, is seen in the death and crucifixion of Jesus. Peter talks about this in the second chapter of Acts on the day of Pentecost when he's speaking to the people in Jerusalem. And he said, "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men." You stop and think about that. Judas betrayed Jesus for his own purposes. Pilate allowed the crucifixion to go forward for his own purposes. The religious leaders of Israel engineered this whole thing for their own purposes. And yet all of them were fulfilling, as Peter says, the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. And it is through this awful human twisted activity that God brings about the greatest blessing of all, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ for our sins. So we can trust in God's good purposes, even in the middle of all the darkness and evil of the world, knowing that people doing selfish and evil things will ultimately serve God's purposes. So human will and God's sovereignty do not conflict, but rather God's sovereignty envelops it all. That ought to give us great confidence and hope as we look at a world where it looks like people aren't doing anything in the name of God or for the glory of God. And we can also understand that our actions can either be in sync with God's purposes or contrary to them, but ultimately, God being God will prevail. So we can hold fast to the truth of God's sovereignty over all things, while also lifting up the truth that people are responsible for their own actions. And so our choice is clear. Are we going to cooperate with God, or are we going to work against Him? Whichever you choose, just remember that, it's kind of like playing cards in Las Vegas. The house always wins, and God always wins. And since we know that, we ought to go ahead and integrate our lives with His purpose for our life, which is what He's designed for our goodness anyway. So trust that God knows what's best for you, and let your decisions be shaped by His word and His will as you seek Him in prayer. Know that God is sovereign, and His purposes are working themselves out, and that we have been invited to be a part of that purpose every day of our lives. God's blessings be upon you this day.